Hello everyone, Stasis here again for the Boards of Canada review. Tomorrow's Harvest. Boards of Canada are a electronic music duo featuring mostly with ambient sounds and, well, some people define it as IDM. I really don't like that term, but, you know, if you're familiar with it, well, you know, there you go. So yeah, I'm going to do this review of Tomorrow's Harvest. I'm extremely tired right now and I'm really bad at describing electronic music. I'll just warn you now. But regardless, my opinions still stand. They just won't come across as easily. So yeah, I've been a fan of Boards of Canada for quite a while. As if you've seen my last event page, you'll see that the listens are quite high for them in comparison to other artists. As well as the fact that I have uploaded already 2 videos before this album was even released, just discussing certain things. Originally doing a video on the announcement and kind of the hype surrounding it, and then the last one talking about Reach for the Dead, which is the second track on the album, which was released as a single, and I'll go over that again in brief. So yeah, I originally thought that this album was going to be most similar to Jacquard, and I think for the most part I'm right. There's some influences from other albums as well, particularly the earlier stuff. The album starts off with a Gemini, or Gemini, I think it's Gemini, and it's got a very brief 80s kind of short intro, literally like 2 or 3 seconds, just at the start of the album to start it off, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it briefly in that people really like Boards of Canada for the nostalgic aspect, but I'm not really into that. I think Boards of Canada have a lot of credit in other points, not just the fact that they sound nostalgic. They sound like the 90s and the 80s, nostalgia for the win, that's what people say, and that's all they get from them. But honestly, I find that to be a bit of a gimmick in music, and thankfully Boards of Canada, while they have that sound, they don't use it as a gimmick. Not in my opinion, at least. I think they have much credit, as I said, in other aspects of their music, and while the sounds are similar, that gimmickiness isn't there. So yeah, Gemini is just kind of, honestly, this album as a whole is more Boards of Canada. It's kind of a little bit of a new sound, and I'll get into that, but overall it's very much Boards of Canada. This track starts off with being this really thick synth, and it's quite dark. It has a lot of this kind of thing through the album, kind of a dark tone to it. These plucked synths come in, and you can tell straight off the bat that the production on this album is really good as well. The textures really show out, and it's really nice to hear that again. And Boards of Canada have always been great for production, so it's not exactly something I was worried about. Reach for the Dead is the second track. I've already talked about this, but I will again. It's a simple Boards of Canada track. I could probably compare it to Day Van Cowboy in its simple progression, accessibility, while having that Boards of Canada sound. It's a very good choice for a single. It's going to entice people who aren't traditionally into Boards of Canada. It's kind of got this like static, this ambient static through it, and a lot of this album does. And there've been keyword transmissions in a lot of their media releases and stuff that they've been saying over the last few weeks. And I think that's a big part of it, that this transmissions, you know, radio transmission being a little bit distorted, featuring static, that sort of stuff. And I'm really dumbing it down, but you know, that comes in a lot of this album. And this album doesn't really have a set theme, not one that people are aware of at least. Some people have said it's like first contact with aliens and that sort of stuff. I don't know, I'm not going to dwell on that, because you know, it is literally just making it up, and I don't like doing that unless you're really sure about it. Reach for the Dead, while being pretty accessible, it is still quite dark. Could probably fit on Jacquard. It kind of is building on that. It's a bit more modern sound. It's kind of hard to explain what it is. It's a straightforward sound. I can compare it to Day Van Cowboy, and I guess a fair bit on the Campfire Head phase, where it's quite accessible ambient music, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just what it sounds like. White Side Closer is another track. It sounded a little bit to me like an interlude. It was about 3 minutes long, but it was really repetitive and didn't really go anywhere. The melody in it sounds a lot like a song off the newest Flaming Lips album. I can't quite remember. If you've heard that album and you listen to this, you'll probably recognise it. But yeah, as I said, like the song didn't really go anywhere, and while it was a decent song on its own, you know, even the 3 minutes, it kind of just repeated over and over again. Didn't really develop, didn't progress, and it was a little bit bland towards the end. Jacquard Causeway, if I'm pronouncing that right, is the longest song on the album, and it kind of starts off with these analog sounds that really hark back to the early Boards of Canada, particularly even the EPs, and of course Music Has the Right to Children. The intro is a little bit uninteresting. It has those really warm analog synths, but at the same time they're just, You know, the melody's kind of, you know, and it doesn't really stand out at all. But it kind of develops into this really trippy kind of section. I don't really know how other to describe it. I said I'm bad at describing electronic music, but it kind of develops in and brings some more other sounds in, which kind of have this kind of trip hop kind of pacing to it, and it's really kind of trippy. But at the same time, it's still not overly interesting. Halfway through the song, it brings in these really kind of bright bell sounding like synths. That kind of makes it pretty interesting. They're very catchy, but again, they're not overly interesting. And then some orchestral synths come in, and again, they're a little bit cheesy. I kind of struggled to appreciate that. It just felt like a bit of a poor attempt to elongate the song a little bit more. Something that I honestly was a little bit disappointed from Boards of Canada. But, you know, that's kind of where my main problems with the album ended, apart from one other song. Telepath. Telepath is, I don't want to call these interludes. I apologise if I call them interludes, because it's a bit of an, you know, it's just me being tired and not saying it right. But they, you know, they kind of have their own sound and they're really good. Telepath is one of these. Again, like the other interludes, quite dark, has these ambient synths with this really distorted sample, which is actually something that's quite a similar theme across this album. A lot of the songs do have these really distorted, undecipherable vocal samples, particularly across these shorter tracks as well. I didn't say interludes. Cold Earth is something that very much would have fell on GeoGaddy. Kind of had that really catchy appeal that a lot of the tracks did, but at the same time it's got that kind of haunting, hollow kind of sound to it. The synths are very rich. It almost reminds me a little bit of Salem, if you heard of them. They're, I think people call them Witch House, so I'm not really sure how to define Witch House. It's kind of, honestly, probably GeoGaddy summarised in one song, you could say. And yeah, it's not in a bad way, it's just, you know, it's a good track and it sounds very much like GeoGaddy. Transmisiones, Ferox, it's French, I think. If my pronunciation is off, I apologise. It's another one of these shorter tracks, not interludes, just shorter tracks. They may be intended to be interludes, I don't know, but they have so much merit on their own. They're really quite effective in there, and they're some of my favourite tracks. It's almost a pity they weren't developed a little bit further, but at the same time they might lose their flavour then. Like Telepath, it has these really dark synths, and they almost sound a little bit woodwind in parts. And very sample heavy again. Sick Times is a bit of a big mess of sound, and well, I shouldn't say mess, it's a lot of sounds put in nicely, and it's kind of, again, what I expected from this album, kind of that darker GeoGaddy type sound, but a little bit further developed. It sounds a little bit more modern. It has some really great detail, it has some really subtle synths in the background, some plucked synths that you really need to be paying attention to hear. That's the sort of stuff that I really like from Boards of Canada. You know, the little intricate details which is so much add to songs, but you wouldn't even think it. And it kind of progresses into a mess of synths and sample, and you know, it's a bit all over the place, and I don't mean that in a bad way, it's cool. Collapse is another kind of shorter song. It starts off with these really warm, nostalgic kind of synths, those, you know, those 70s, 80s kind of synths that you're used to with Boards of Canada. Quite repetitive, a little bit hypnotic if you like, and it doesn't really progress much, but again, it's a little bit shorter and it doesn't feel like it needs to progress at all. It has this really, another dark vocoded sample, as like a lot of these tracks do. Palace Posy. This is my other issue with the album, and I think it will be a fair few people's. Purely from the fact that regardless whether you like the track or not, it is so out of place, it's not funny. It's extremely, extremely obnoxious. It's got those really warm synth that you would hear on their very early EPs, like I'm talking before Music Has the Right to Children. I shouldn't say very early, but you know what I mean. It's not a terrible track on its own, though it is a little bit obnoxious for me. Main issue is the transition between the kind of darker Collapse and this. It just immediately goes from this kind of dark ambient, you know, static written ambient sounds to this just obnoxious analog, you know, the Boards of Canada that you would have heard in their early days. The track kind of develops a bit. It does develop, and it does become much more tolerable as some more sounds are incorporated. But at the same time, the melody itself is kind of uninteresting. So while it is extremely obnoxious, it's actually just kind of annoying rather than infectious. It finishes off in a bit of a better way. It has this another sample in there, and kind of a bit more uplifting, bright, but not, still very catchy in that, but not in the irritating way. Split Your Infinities is another song that I really like. It has these really bright backgrounds, plucked synths, which I could probably compare to like 90s news television intros. This sounds a little bit odd, but that's just where I get it from. You know, the 80s, 90s kind of sports, intense sound that you'd hear. And it's put in this album in a really nice way, kind of put in this song in a really nice way. a contrast with the really lazy thick synths, which are a little bit more present over the top, and it's just a really great track. It has a lot of detail, and it has a kind of newer sound that you don't, that Boards of Canada haven't really done in the past, which is nice. Like, don't get me wrong, it sounds like Boards of Canada, it just sounds a bit more modern, and a couple of these tracks do, and I think it's just a bit of a build on the Campfire Head Phaser sound. Uritual, this is another one of those short little tracks that aren't interludes, and it's, again, really great. It has another really dark sound, has another really dark vocal sample. It sounds very alien. This is a lot of people saying that this album might, like the theme of this album might be like the first encounter with aliens, and this kind of would go with that. It does sound a bit like, you know, something you would expect to hear in an alien movie or something. Nothing Is Real is another bit of a more cheerful track. It's the synths are a little bit more brighter, but at the same time the track still sounds a little bit dark. Does that make sense? The sounds are all higher, but the track itself is still a bit creepy and dark. It still has that that vocal sample in there, which is a bit creepy, and it's a very repetitive track, but in like a good way, kind of hypnotizing. Sundown is a very ambient track, the traditional ambient. There's not much in there except just the synths, which are really present, and they're very relaxing. The funny thing about this album, this song is, it's called Sundown, and while the live stream was going, if you guys don't know, there was a live stream where where Boards of Canada streamed their album for the first time on YouTube, and in the UK it was actually as the sun was going down, and like, I don't know, was that a coincidence? I don't know. It was kind of cool regardless. In Australia it was the opposite, sun was coming up, which was, I was up at 6 AM watching that, so that was a joy. New Seeds is another kind of a little bit more obnoxious track, but it's not a bad one, it's a good track. At the same time, I don't know, it's borderline a little bit out of place, but at the same time it's not too bad as a more cheery track on the album. Has some really infectious melodies in some of the more subtle sounds. That's what I love about Boards of Canada. They can have some really present synths, but it's the background sounds which really contribute to the main track, which is really quite, and this track is one of those examples. Has kind of these harmonies in these plucked synths, which is really nice. Come to Dust, I struggled to write about this track because honestly it's just another Boards of Canada track. There's nothing wrong with it, like it's a good track, but it's just, there's not really any standout features to it. And then Semena, Mertvykh, or something like that, is the outro. I believe the actual track name is in Russian or something, so, I definitely pronounce that wrong because Russians have letters which aren't letters. The track is very, very dark. It's kind of the sound that I was hoping to hear on this album as a whole, but the album was a little bit inconsistent for that, and that's my main issue with the track, which is nothing wrong with it. It kind of reminds me of how inconsistent this album can be. But the track itself is really, really good. It's one of my favourites, certainly probably my favourites of the darker, shorter tracks. So yeah, overall, as I said, the album's a bit inconsistent, and the flow is a little bit messed up by some of these tracks which are really bright, particularly Palace Posy. And there's a couple of tracks on there which just do kind of feel a little bit safe going through the motions. Jacquard, or whatever it's pronounced, Causeway, is a bit of an indicator of that. It feels a bit like going through the motions. And I know I'm not the only person that thinks that, because I did look at some other people's opinions. I do like to look at other people's opinions to see if I'm just not getting a song or something. That was with Queens of the Stone Age. I wasn't getting some of those songs until I really sat down and listened to it a couple of times. So yeah, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. It's a good album. It's just a little inconsistent in parts, and as I said, it messes up the flow a bit. It's got its kind of own sound, this album. I think that's thanks to a lot of the darker tracks having that really big bass at the bottom of them to really give them a big ambient kind of feel, as well as that the soft static which is going through the album is kind of that Transmissions kind of theme, and those really dark vocal samples which pop up in almost all of the tracks. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. I expect I'm going to probably get a little bit of hate for this because I did bring out some negative things. And yeah, it's one of those reviews where I kind of bring out a lot of bad stuff, but at the same time, these tracks which I'm saying are good tracks, they're not good tracks, they are fantastic tracks. They are extremely, extremely good, hence why the rating I gave is still quite high, despite there being a couple of tracks which are a little bit more average. And when I say average tracks, they're not bad tracks. Apart from Palace Posy, I'm not a fan of that one. The other ones, they're all at least decent tracks. So yeah, again, let me know what you think. I've actually ordered this album on vinyl. It's coming soon, hopefully. I'll do a vinyl showcase. So if you're interested in seeing the packaging and, all of that sort of stuff, then make sure you wait for that. It should be here in the next couple of weeks. I've got no idea whether they sent it before the release or they sent it on the release, I don't know. But either way, it'll be here soon, and I will see you guys then.